Rex Harlow had been riding motorcycles for 39 years, and in all that time he had developed exactly one hard rule about how to read a room. Watch the hands. Not the eyes, not the face, not the voice. The hands told you everything you needed to know about a man. Whether he was nervous, whether he was bluffing, whether he had already made up his mind about what he was going to do next. Hands didn't lie the way faces did. Hands couldn't be coached or controlled the way voices could. When a man's hands started shaking, it didn't matter what his mouth was saying. The hands were already telling the truth. 39 years. That was how long Rex had been paying attention to that particular truth. Through bar fights and backroad negotiations, in rooms where the wrong word at the wrong moment could end something permanently. Through county sheriff's offices and the occasional federal waiting room, and more than one conversation that had started friendly and turned into something that required very careful navigation before it was over. 39 years of watching hands in the rule had never once failed him. It was a Wednesday night in late October when the rule saved 6 lives, though Rex wouldn't have described it that way. He would have said he was drinking coffee and something went sideways and he paid attention. That was all. That was the whole story as far as he was concerned. But the camera above the coffee machine recorded something different. Sunset Junction Diner sat at the intersection of State Route 89 and a county road that didn't have an official name on most maps, just a number that the locals ignored in favor of calling it the Copper Road because of the color the desert turned in October when the light came in at the right angle. The diner had been there for 31 years in various forms of ownership and renovation. Rex had owned it for 11 of those years, though most people who came through didn't know that. What they knew was that the coffee was strong, the pie was honest, and the booths were deep enough that a man could sit in one for 2 hours without feeling like he owed anyone an explanation. Rex's booth was the corner one, second from the back on the left side position so that a man sitting in it could see both the front door and the kitchen pass-through at the same time, without turning his head more than 45 degrees in either direction. He had chosen that booth the first week he owned the place and had been sitting in it every Wednesday night since. It was the kind of routine that a man earned after 57 years of life that had not been uniformly gentle. The right to sit in a specific corner and not justify yourself to anyone. The right to drink your coffee in peace. The diner was quiet for a Wednesday. That was the first thing Rex registered when he walked in that night, the specific texture of the quiet. Not empty, there were people. Connie Voss was working the floor, moving between the tables with the efficient, unhurried energy of a woman who had been waitressing for 16 years and had long since achieved the mastery of her space that came from knowing every table's wobble, every customer's preference, every shortcut between the counter and the kitchen that saved steps over the course of a shift. She was carrying a coffee pot in her right hand and not wasting a single movement. 2 truckers sat at the counter. Big men, both of them, the build of men who had spent years behind a wheel and developed the patience that long distances required. They were eating pie and not talking to each other, the comfortable silence of men who had already said everything they needed to say, somewhere out on the highway, and had arrived at a place where silence was company enough. A young couple occupied the far booth. They were sharing a plate of fries and keeping their voices low, leaning toward each other with the self-contained quality of people who were in their own world and had no interest in the larger one. The girl laughed quietly at something. The young man reached across and took a fry from her side of the plate, and she mock protested, and then they went quiet again, leaning in. An older gentleman sat by the window with a newspaper folded exactly in half, the way men of a certain generation always folded newspapers, the vertical crease sharp and deliberate. He was reading with the unhurried attention of someone who had decided that the news would proceed at his pace rather than the other way around. And at the table near the jukebox, 3 men in leather vests were arguing about a carburetor. Colt Briggs, who had been a mechanic for 22 years before he retired into a life that was harder to explain to civilians, was 53 years old and built like a man who had spent those 22 years actually using his body for physical work, rather than just supervising people who did. He had forearms like bridge cable and a voice that came from somewhere low and settled, and he was currently making a point about fuel-to-air ratios that he had apparently been making for 3 weeks without achieving satisfactory resolution. Hank Dillard sat across from him, 48 years old, 8 years in the Army before the chapter had found him, or he had found the chapter. The distinction blurred in the way that it blurred for men who had been looking for a particular kind of structure and loyalty and had found it in an unexpected place. Hank had a gift for finding information that wasn't publicly presented as findable. He did it quietly without drama the way he did most things. He was listening to Colt's carburetor argument with the expression of someone who had already formed his own opinion and was waiting patiently for the conversation to catch up to it. And Sal Pruitt, 38 years old and the youngest of the three, by a significant margin was drumming his fingers on the table in the unconscious rhythm of a man who had a great deal of energy and not quite enough outlets for it. It was his carburetor they were arguing about. He had opinions about the diagnosis, and he was waiting for an opening to express them. Rex had known these three men for a combined total of 31 years. He trusted them the way you trusted men. You had been in difficult rooms with, not because you had decided to trust them, but because the rooms had made the decision for you by showing you exactly what they were made of when things went wrong. He settled into his corner booth and nodded to Connie when she came by without being asked, which meant he wanted the coffee and she should bring it without ceremony. She brought it. He wrapped both hands around the cup and sat with the warmth of it for a moment, looking at nothing in particular present in the specific way that being present in a place you owned and understood felt different from being present anywhere else. The night was doing what October nights did in northern Arizona. The cold came down from the altitude after sunset and pressed against the windows from outside, and you could feel it even through the glass. The insistence of the desert at elevation, reminding you that summer was a visitor here, not a resident. Inside the diner, it was warm, and the warmth had the weight of earned comfort, the kind you appreciated more because you knew exactly how cold it was on the other side of the walls. Rex drank his coffee. He was on his second cup, deep in the comfortable rhythm of a late Wednesday that was proceeding exactly as expected when the sound of an 18-wheeler rose outside and peaked and faded into the distance, the way highway sounds always did, rising and going and leaving behind a silence that was slightly deeper than the one before it. The refrigerator unit in the kitchen hummed its single continuous note. The jukebox was dark but not broken, just unplayed. Colt was still talking about the carburetor. Rex was not thinking about anything in particular. Then the bell above the front door chimed at 12:17 in the morning. He didn't look up right away. He heard the door, heard the cold air come in from outside. You could always feel the October wind before you saw it, and he reached for his coffee cup without turning his head. That was habit, not inattention. A man learned after enough years to let the first second of a new arrival tell him whether it required his direct attention or not. The second set of footsteps told him. Not one man coming in. Two. And something about the rhythm of those footsteps, the particular way they stopped too quickly just inside the door with the abruptness of men who had crossed a threshold and were now recalculating rather than proceeding, made Rex set his cup back down on the table without drinking from it. He looked up. The first man through the door was wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled up and a bandana pulled up over his nose and mouth. He was young. Rex could tell by the build, by the way he was standing, the distribution of weight and tension in a body that hadn't yet learned how to be still under pressure. He was holding a handgun at chest height, with both hands the muzzle pointed at the ceiling. His eyes were moving in rapid jerks across the room, scanning in the way eyes moved when the heart rate behind them had already climbed into dangerous territory. The second man posted himself against the wall beside the door. He had a shotgun. Sawed off, which meant it had been modified deliberately, which meant someone had thought about this in advance. Not professionals, the first man's eyes told Rex that immediately, but not people who had grabbed the nearest available weapons either. This had been planned, or someone had tried to plan it. There was a difference between a plan and an execution, and what Rex was watching was the execution falling apart in real time. Nobody move. The first man's voice was loud and had the specific quality of loudness that came from forcing volume through a throat that was tight with adrenaline. Hands on the table right now. Hands on the table, everybody. His voice cracked on the last word. That was the first thing Rex registered with the full weight of his attention. Not the gun, not the mask, the crack in the voice, the way it climbed and then broke the way a young man's voice broke when he was trying to project certainty he did not feel, when the performance of confidence was being undermined by the physical reality of fear. Rex watched the room respond. Connie froze in the center of the floor. The coffee pot was still in her hand arm, suspended at her side, her whole body gone rigid in the way a body went rigid when it was waiting for instruction from a mind that had stopped giving instructions. Her eyes went to Rex for just a fraction of a second before she looked back at the men at the door. He saw it. The look of a woman who had worked for him for 11 years and was in this moment trusting him to know what to do. The two truckers at the counter both went very still. Not the still of fear exactly. These were men who had driven long haul for decades and had developed a practical relationship with danger that was different from panic, but the careful stillness of men who understood that sudden motion in a room with guns in it was a bad idea, regardless of who you were or how large you were. The older gentleman by the window lowered his newspaper. He did it with the controlled, deliberate movement of someone who understood the physics of the situation. Slow motion was invisible motion, and invisible motion was the safest kind. He placed the newspaper on the table with both hands visible and sat with the settled patience of a man who had lived long enough to know that most situations, if you didn't make them worse, eventually resolved themselves. The young couple in the back booth, the girl made a sound that was half a gasp and half something that couldn't decide what it was, and the young man grabbed her hand under the table. Rex saw his knuckles go white. He pulled her closer. Colt and Hank and Sal had stopped talking about the carburetor. Rex Harlow did not put his hands on the table. He looked at the two men standing in his doorway, and he took a slow, measured breath that nobody in the room could see him take, and he wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. The ceramic was warm. He focused on that warmth for one deliberate second. Then he looked at the first man directly. "Sir?" The young man's voice climbed again. "Hands on the table. I said hands on the table." "My hands are busy," Rex said. The words came out completely flat. Not defiant, not aggressive, not challenging in any way that could be called theatrical. Just matter of fact, the way a man responded if someone told him to stop reading a book he was in the middle of, and he had no particular reason to comply. The same tone Rex used when someone gave him directions he already knew. He lifted the coffee cup, took a sip, set it back down. The diner went so quiet that the refrigerator's hum was perfectly audible. The young man with the handgun took 2 steps toward Rex's booth. He moved with the jerky energy of someone whose body was operating on a chemical fuel that he didn't have full control of yet. Are you serious right now? I have a gun." "I can see that," Rex said. He looked at the young man directly, not staring him down, not making a performance of it, just looking at him the way you looked at a person you were genuinely trying to understand, the way you looked when you were paying real attention. "I can also see that your hands are shaking." Nobody said anything for a long moment. "My hands are not shaking." The denial came too fast and too loud. The velocity of a denial that arrived before the accused had finished processing the accusation, the reflexive repudiation that always in Rex's experience confirmed exactly what it was trying to deny. Rex tilted his head very slightly. "Son, I've been watching people's hands for almost 40 years. He said it without heat, without condescension, without any particular emphasis at all. He said it the way a man stated a fact that was simply true. "Those hands are shaking." Connie made a sound from the center of the floor. Something between a prayer and a plea, too quiet to be words, just a breath that carried the weight of the moment she was standing in. The second man, the one by the door with the sawed-off, spoke for the first time. His voice was different from the first man's. Harder, more controlled, but with an edge to it that had a different quality than the shaking voice of his partner. Not professional control, desperate control. The kind that came from a man who had committed to something and was holding the decision together through force of will rather than confidence. "Devlin," he said. "Stop talking to him. Get the register." "Devlin." Rex filed the name away. The young man with the handgun, Devlin, 27 years old, though Rex didn't know that yet, blond and looking like he hadn't slept properly in the better part of a week. His eyes bloodshot above the bandana, turned away from Rex's booth and moved toward the counter, toward Connie, toward the register. Rex watched him move and registered everything. The work boots rather than sneakers. The way the hoodie hung on him, a size too large a man who had recently lost weight rather than a man who had bought a size up. The set of his shoulders, not aggressive, not predatory, something else. Something that didn't belong in the body language of a man who had made a clear decision to take what he wanted from a room full of people. Something apologetic. "The register," Devlin said to Connie. His voice had dropped. The loudness from before was gone. What was left was quieter and in its own way more complicated. "Open the register, please." Rex heard that word land in the room like something dropped from a height. Not slam drop, the quiet impact of something that didn't make a loud noise but that you felt in the floor. "Please." He watched Connie blink, watched the small, bewildered furrow appear between her eyebrows, because armed robbers didn't say please, and the incongruity of it had apparently reached her even through the fear. He could see her processing it the way a person processed something that didn't fit the category they had placed it in. Devlin moved closer to the counter. His gun hand had dropped slightly, not all the way down, not to his side, but lower than before, the muzzle tilting toward the floor by a few degrees. It was an unconscious movement. Rex was certain of that. The man didn't know he'd done it. "The register," Devlin said again, quieter still. "Just open it. I don't want to scare you." "You already scared her," Rex said. Devlin turned back toward the booth. His eyes found Rex over the bandana. "Sir, I'm asking you to please stop talking." "I know you are." "A beat. I have a gun." "You mentioned that," Rex said. The man by the door pushed off from the wall. He had been still since taking his position, the deliberate stillness of someone who had assigned himself a role, cover the door, watch the room, and was executing it. But something in the exchange between Devlin and the man in the corner booth had broken through that stillness and replaced it with agitation. He crossed the floor 3 steps before stopping the sawed-off coming up. "What is wrong with you?" His voice was tight. Controlled and tight, the combination that came from a man who was very close to losing the control he was exercising. "Are you crazy? Do you have a death wish?" "Neither," Rex said. He picked up his coffee cup again. "I just don't scare easy." The man raised the shotgun, not pointing it directly at Rex, not yet, but raising it the unmistakable visual language of escalation, the gesture that said the next stage was available and was being considered. "You should," he said. From the table near the jukebox, Colt Briggs cleared his throat. It was a quiet sound, barely audible. The kind of sound a large man made when he wanted to redirect attention without making any sudden movements that might be misread. But the man with the shotgun swung toward it immediately, instinct overriding tactics, and then stopped. Because he was now aware, possibly for the first time since he'd walked through the door, that there were 3 more men in this room who were not on the floor and not showing any signs of fear. 3 more men in leather vests, sitting at a table not 15 feet from where he was standing. 3 men who had been watching the entire thing unfold with the patient, unhurried attention of people who were not panicking because they had made a collective decision that panic was not the appropriate response. The patches on their vests told a story. The man with the shotgun looked at the vests, then he looked at Rex, then he looked back at the vests. His jaw moved, but nothing came out. Rex had been watching this particular realization travel across the faces of people who walked into his diner without having done adequate research for 11 years. It always took about 3 seconds. The initial confidence of someone who had assessed the room as containable. Then the second assessment, the one that revised the first. Then the stillness that followed the revision, the moment a person understood that the situation they had walked into was meaningfully different from the situation they had imagined they were walking into. 3 seconds, right on schedule. "You picked this diner," Rex said quietly, without doing a lot of research. "Just..." The man with the shotgun stopped, started again. His voice had lost its edge, not gone soft, but shifted the anger replaced by something more complicated. Everybody just be calm. We just want the money. We're not here to hurt anyone. Then that's something, Rex said. Connie had opened the register. She was standing behind the counter with both hands on the keys, and Rex could see from 20 feet away that her hands were trembling, but her face had settled into a focused, deliberate expression. She was doing what needed to be done. That was Connie. 16 years of working a room had given her a kind of practical courage that had nothing to do with bravado and everything to do with simply continuing to function when functioning was what was required. She got the drawer open. Devlin leaned over the counter and looked at the bills in the register drawer. Something crossed his face that Rex had not expected to see. Not satisfaction, not the relief of a man who had just gotten what he came for. What crossed Devlin's face was defeat. The hollow defeat of a man who had driven a long way and risked everything and had arrived to find exactly the wrong thing waiting for him. There wasn't much in the register. A Wednesday night after midnight at a highway diner. Maybe $250. Devlin stared at that drawer for a long moment. Rex watched the shoulders inside the gray hoodie drop by 2 inches. Watched the gun hand lower by 4. And in that moment, looking at a 27-year-old man staring at $250, as if it were a verdict on something much larger than the money itself, Rex understood something that none of the other people in that diner had yet understood. This robbery had not been planned because these men wanted money. It had been planned because they were desperate. There was a difference. Rex had been around long enough to know what that difference looked like in a man's body, in his posture, in the shape of his defeat when the plan failed to produce what the plan had been intended to save. There's maybe 250 in there, Rex said. 300 at most. Devlin didn't look up from the register drawer. That's not going to solve whatever problem you're trying to solve tonight, Rex said. The man with the shotgun was moving again, tense and agitated, the weapon swaying in a way that had become less deliberate and more instinctive. Stop. Stop talking. He was looking at Devlin now more than at the room. Bag it up and let's go. Caleb? Devlin said the name quietly. Rex filed that one away too. Caleb, 29 years old, from what Rex's reading of him suggested, a man who had been talked into something by someone he trusted and was now holding the consequences of that trust in his hands with a sawed-off shotgun. He was the harder of the two on the surface. The more aggressive one, the one who had covered the door and raised the weapon and issued the threats. But underneath the aggression was something Rex recognized as a secondary quality, the behavior of a man who was protecting someone else rather than pursuing his own ends. Bag it up, Caleb said again. His voice had gone tight. Devlin, we are leaving. It's not enough, Devlin said. His voice was flat now, stripped of everything except the fact itself. You know it's not enough. It was never going to be enough. Then we find somewhere else. There is nowhere else. Devlin's voice broke on the last word. Just slightly, just enough. He said it again, quieter. There is nowhere else, Caleb. I've been looking for 6 months. There is nowhere. He stopped talking. He stopped talking and just stood there leaning on the counter with the gun in his hand pointed at nothing, staring at $250 and whatever had been holding him upright through this night. The adrenaline, the desperation, the forward momentum of having made a terrible decision and committed to it, whatever that was, it had run out. Rex watched this. He watched it with the full attention he had given everything in this room tonight, the attention that came from 39 years of learning that the most important moments were never the loudest ones. They were the quiet ones, the ones where something true became visible through the surface of what a man was performing. He set his coffee cup down on the table. He didn't slam it. He didn't make any dramatic gesture. He just set it down and then he leaned forward very slightly and he looked at Devlin Mercer with the kind of direct, uncomplicated attention that most people never gave anyone anymore. Look at me, Rex said. Devlin looked at him. How much trouble are you really in? The question sat in the air of Sunset Junction Diner for a long time. Not a rhetorical question. Not a tactical question. A real one asked by a man who wanted a real answer, and whose voice carried the weight of someone who was prepared to hear whatever the answer actually was. Nobody moved. Not Connie, not the truckers, not the older gentleman who had set his newspaper down and was sitting with the stillness of a man who had spent enough years watching things unfold to know when something important was happening. Not Colt or Hank or Sal, who had been sitting at that table through everything, with the patience of men who understood that sometimes the most powerful thing you could do was hold your position and let something play out. Caleb said, "Devlin, don't." Devlin looked at Rex. His jaw worked. His eyes above the bandana were red-rimmed. Not from the bandana. They had been red-rimmed when he walked through the door. He was exhausted in the way that had nothing to do with one missed night of sleep, and everything to do with months of the grinding, daily accumulating kind of exhaustion that settled into a man's bones and changed the way he moved through the world. The kind that made everything heavier. The kind that made a man walk into a diner at midnight with a gun because he couldn't see any other door. "Devlin," Caleb said again, "don't say anything to him." Devlin looked at the gun in his hand. He looked at Rex. Then slowly he walked to the booth and sat down across from Rex. He placed the gun on the table, muzzle pointing at the wall away from everyone. His hands were shaking again. He pressed them flat on the tabletop and took a breath that he had clearly needed for a long time. After a moment, Caleb crossed the floor. He didn't speak. He sat down next to Devlin. The sawed-off he placed under the table on the bench seat beside him, within sight of the room, within reach of no one else. It was the gesture of a man who had just made a decision he wasn't entirely sure about and was making it anyway. Connie let out a breath. It was the only sound in the diner for one full second, the release of something she had been holding since the door had swung open, and it seemed to give the whole room permission to breathe again. Rex looked at the two young men across from him. He thought about what he knew. He thought about the work boots and the weight loss and the voice that said, "Please," to a cashier he was robbing. He thought about the shape of Devlin's defeat when he looked at $250. He thought about what it meant to run out of road so completely that walking into a room with a gun felt like the only door left. He had seen it before. Not the specific version, but the shape of it, the machinery of it. He knew what that machinery looked like from the outside, and he knew what it looked like from the inside. And the thing he had learned in 39 years of watching rooms and watching hands was that the two views were almost nothing alike. "Start from the beginning," Rex said. "All of it." Devlin looked at him across the table. Something in his face shifted. Not relief, it was too early for relief, and whatever was coming next was not going to be easy regardless of how tonight resolved. But something. The shift of a man who had been carrying something alone for a very long time and was looking at the first person who had seemed to genuinely want to know the weight of it. He took one more breath. And then Devlin Mercer, 27 years old, sitting in a diner in northern Arizona at 12:31 in the morning with a gun on the table in front of him, and three Hells Angels riders 12 feet away, began to talk. He started with his daughter. Her name was Lily. She had been born healthy, had spent her first 2 years being exactly what a 2-year-old was supposed to be. Loud, curious, and destructive, in the joyful way that small children were destructive, leaving evidence of her existence on every surface she touched. She was walking by 11 months. She was talking in full sentences by 22. She had strong opinions about the color of her shoes and weak opinions about anything that required sitting still. Then 3 months before her 3rd birthday, she started falling down. Not the way toddlers fell, not the comedic, rubbery tumbles that ended in laughter and a quick scramble back to standing. The other kind. The kind where her legs simply stopped working without warning, without reason, without any external cause that Devlin or his wife Casey could identify. She would be walking across the kitchen, and then she would simply be on the floor looking up at them with an expression of pure bewilderment, as if her own body had surprised her. They took her to their primary care doctor, then to a specialist in Flagstaff, then to a hospital in Phoenix that had a pediatric neurology department and doctors who had seen things like this before. The diagnosis took 11 weeks. The surgery was scheduled 6 days after that. By the time Lily was out of the operating room and the doctors were telling Devlin and Casey that she was going to be fine, that she was going to walk again and run, and probably not remember any of this by the time she was old enough to have memories that stuck. By that point, the billing department had already generated the first invoice, $240,000. Thousand. Devlin said it the way people said numbers that had stopped feeling real. Flat, almost without inflection, as if the number had been repeated so many times in his head and on paper and in conversations with banking officers and financial counselors that it had worn smooth like a stone turned over and over in a pocket until all the sharp edges were gone and what was left was just weight. That was after insurance, he said. After everything. After every benefit had been applied and every covered procedure had been accounted for. That was the number left over. The gap between what medicine cost and what medicine was paid for, expressed in a single figure that sat on a piece of paper and waited for someone to solve it. Rex listened without interrupting. He had learned a long time ago that you didn't direct a man who was just starting to trust you with the part of the story he'd been most afraid to tell. You let him arrive at it himself. You stayed still and you paid attention, and you let the silence work for you, because silence, the kind that felt like receiving rather than waiting, was one of the few things that could make a frightened man feel genuinely heard. 3 banks, Devlin said, 2 credit unions. His savings were gone inside the first month. Casey's parents didn't have it. His own parents were gone. He had done the math in every direction it could be done, and the answer kept coming back the same. And then a man he worked with mentioned the name Warren Goss. Rex's hands tightened slightly around his coffee cup. He didn't show it, but he registered it the first time the name landed in the room. The name that would change everything about the rest of the night. Warren Goss ran a pawn shop on the south side of Flagstaff. The pawn shop was the front. Everyone knew the pawn shop was the front. Nobody had ever done anything about it being the front. Devlin had gone there because he was out of options, and someone he trusted had said Warren Goss could help. And when a man is out of options and someone he trusts says help is available, the details of how the help works become secondary to the simple fact of its existence. The loan was $60,000. Bridge loan, Warren had called it. The interest rate was 18% annually high, but not insane, not for someone with no collateral and a credit score that had been destroyed by a medical emergency. Devlin had read the document. He thought he had read the document. He had sat in Warren Goss's office in the back of the pawn shop, and he had read the number and heard the word annually and signed. The 18% was monthly, not annually, monthly, and it compounded on the unpaid balance. And there were fees for late payment, and those fees compounded too. Within 4 months, Devlin owed more than he had borrowed. He kept making payments. He made them every week, whatever he could scrape together from the job and from Casey's extra shifts and from the side work he picked up wherever he could find it. He was reducing the principal. He was certain of it. But the number on the statement kept going up, and the gap between what he paid and what the interest added was widening every month. And by the time he understood what was happening, he was already too deep inside it to see the surface. Then he lost his job in month 5. Company downsized. Not his fault. Not anyone's fault in particular. Just the ordinary, brutal mathematics of a business that needed to reduce its payroll and chose to start with the people who had been there the least time. Casey picked up more shifts. She worked doubles. She came home with her feet aching and her voice thin from exhaustion, and she didn't complain because they both understood that complaining wasn't a category that was available to them anymore. Complaining required surplus. They were operating well below surplus. And then in month 6, a man showed up at the house. Big man, Devlin said. Came in a car that was newer than anything on their street, parked in the driveway, walked up to the front porch, and talked to Devlin very quietly about what happened to people who stopped paying. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't make any specific threats. He stood on the front porch of the house where Devlin's daughter slept. And he looked at the house, and he looked at Devlin, and he said calmly, pleasantly, with the controlled delivery of a man who had said this sentence many times before, "A man's priorities tend to clarify when the right kind of pressure gets applied." Then he walked back to the car and drove away. Rex said nothing for a moment after that. He sat with the information, letting it settle, letting it become fully real before he responded to it. From the table near the jukebox, he heard Colt exhale, just barely, the exhale of a man absorbing something that had reached him. "How much do you owe him now?" Rex asked. 14,800, Devlin said. His voice was stripped clean again, the flatness of a number that had been reduced from its worst to something that was still catastrophic. "I got it down from more. It took everything. Casey and I had, every side job, everything we could sell. We got it down to 14.8. He pressed his lips together. He said I had until Friday to clear the balance. All of it. "What's Friday?" Rex said. 4 days from now." Rex looked at Devlin's hands still flat on the table. They had stopped shaking just barely. Not because the fear was gone, but because the effort of telling the truth had steadied something in him that the performance of robbery hadn't. Telling the truth, Rex had observed over a long life, often did that. It was the lying and the performing that made men shake. The truth, even a terrible truth, had a stillness to it. "And Kenny Hartwell," Caleb said from beside Devlin. He had been quiet through most of this, and now he spoke with the careful, deliberate quality of a man choosing which information to release and how. "Kenny went to Goss 2 years ago. Couldn't pay. 6 weeks later, Kenny's in the hospital. Hit and run." He looked at Rex directly. "Except it wasn't." Rex said nothing. "He walks with a cane now," Caleb said. "He's 29 years old, and his right hand doesn't work right anymore, and he walks with a cane." The information settled into the room. The truckers at the counter hadn't moved. The young couple in the back booth were very still, the girl's face turned away now, pressed against the young man's shoulder. The older gentleman by the window had his hands folded on the table. Rex looked at the two young men across from him. He thought about 39 years of watching hands. He thought about everything those hands had told him tonight, the shaking and the dropping and the pressing flat on the tabletop, and the careful placement of a gun in a direction away from people. He thought about a little girl named Lily who had started falling down 3 months before her 3rd birthday, and about a hospital in Phoenix, and about a number on a piece of paper that had eaten a young family alive for 8 months. He picked up his coffee cup. It was cold. He drank it anyway. Then he set it down and he looked at Devlin Mercer and he said, "Put the 250 back in the register." Caleb stared at him. "What?" "You didn't take it for Warren Goss," Rex said. His voice was level and plain, the voice he used when he was saying something that was simply true and didn't require decoration. "You took it because you were running out of ideas, and panic makes people take action that doesn't solve the problem. Put it back." He looked at Connie. She had come forward from behind the counter during Devlin's story, drawn toward the booth, the way a person was sometimes drawn toward a fire, not recklessly, but because the warmth was real and the cold outside, it was not. She was standing closer to the table than she had been, her arms folded across her chest, the coffee pot set down somewhere behind her. "Connie," Rex said, "register still open." "Yes," she said. Devlin reached into his hoodie pocket and produced the envelope. He placed it on the table without looking at it. Connie came forward, took it, and went back to the register without ceremony. Her hands were still slightly unsteady, but her face had settled into something resolved, the look of a woman who had decided which version of this night she was going to be a participant in. Rex put his phone on the table. "I'm going to make a call," he said. "There's a man I know. His name is Frank Calder. He's an attorney. He works with cases involving predatory lending, and he has worked with federal prosecutors before." Rex looked at both young men. "He is not going to ask me why I'm calling him at 12:30 in the morning, because he knows that when I call it matters." The diner was silent except for the refrigerator's hum. "But before I make that call," Rex said, "I need to know everything about Warren Goss. Not what you've heard, what you know." Devlin looked at the phone on the table. Caleb looked at Devlin. Rex waited. Outside on Route 89, an 18-wheeler rose in the distance and came on and passed and went away. The sound of it filled the diner for 10 seconds, and then it was gone. And in the silence it left behind, Devlin Mercer reached out and touched the edge of Rex's phone. Not picking it up, just touching it. "If we do this," he said. His voice was careful. the voice of a man measuring his words against the weight of what they would set in motion. What happens to us? Rex looked at him steadily. I'll be honest with you. I don't know exactly. You walked in here with guns. That happened. It's on the camera. He held Devlin's gaze. But a man who walked into a diner out of desperation and walked out having put the money back is a different man in front of a judge than a man who didn't. Devlin was quiet. Then he said very quietly, "My daughter can't have her father in prison. She just learned to walk again." "I know," Rex said. "That's why we're doing this tonight." Something moved through Devlin's face. Something that had been locked for a long time, that the weight of 8 months had built walls around, that the running and the fear and the failing had sealed over until it was almost unrecognizable. And then it moved just slightly, like the first shift of ice in late winter, when the temperature turns and the thing that has been frozen begins almost imperceptibly to change. Devlin Mercer nodded. It was a small nod, decisive, not dramatic, just a single movement of his head that meant yes, and I understand what I'm agreeing to, and I'm agreeing to it anyway. Rex picked up the phone. He dialed Frank Calder's number from memory, the kind of memory that lived not just in a device, but in the mind itself, because a man who had spent his life in complicated rooms knew that phones got lost and broken and taken, but a number carried in the head stayed with you. It rang twice. Frank Calder answered on the third ring awake, his voice carrying the clarity of a man who slept lightly because the work had trained him to. "Rex? Frank, I need you at Sunset Junction Diner, the 89. I need you here in person." A pause. "Tonight." "Tonight?" Another pause shorter. "Is everyone safe?" Rex looked at Devlin Mercer's hands flat on the table, steady now. He looked at Connie standing behind the counter with the register closed, watching. He looked at the truckers who hadn't left, who had stayed at the counter through all of it without anyone asking them to, sitting with the quiet solidarity of strangers who had been through something together and understood that leaving felt wrong. "Everyone's safe," Rex said. "But I've got 2 young men here who are going to need someone in their corner before morning." He heard Frank moving on the other end of the line. Keys, a door, the sound of a man putting on a jacket in a hurry. 45 minutes, Frank said. "I'll have coffee waiting," Rex said. He hung up. He set the phone down on the table. Then he looked at Devlin and then at Caleb and then back at Devlin, and he said, "Now, tell me everything you know about Warren Goss." And that was when Devlin started talking about the ledger. The ledger that nobody outside Warren Goss's operation was supposed to know existed. Devlin had not planned to tell anyone about it. He had not planned to tell anyone about any of this, the loan, the interest, the man on the porch, the 8 months of drowning in a debt that multiplied while he slept. He had kept it from Casey's parents, from the few friends he still had, from everyone who might have looked at him differently for having walked into that pawn shop and signed a document he hadn't read carefully enough. The shame of it was its own kind of weight, separate from the financial weight, and in some ways heavier. Because financial weight was external. It came from outside and pressed in. But shame lived inside and pressed out, and there was nowhere to put it down. But Rex Harlow was looking at him across a diner booth at 12:38 in the morning with the kind of attention that Devlin had not encountered in 8 months of trying to solve an unsolvable problem. Not judgment, not pity, not the barely concealed impatience of a bank officer who had already decided the answer before the question was finished. Just attention, the real kind. The kind that asked a question and then waited for the actual answer rather than the comfortable version of it. So Devlin told him about the ledger. 6 months ago, he had been called to Warren Goss's office for what Warren described as a routine review, a sitting down, a going over of the numbers, a recalculation of the payment schedule. Devlin had arrived at the pawn shop on the south side at 2 in the afternoon and been told to wait in the back office while Warren finished a phone call in the hallway. He sat in the chair across from Warren's desk and waited. The safe was in the wall to his left, behind a painting that was slightly crooked, in the way that paintings were crooked when they had been moved and replaced many times. Devlin hadn't thought anything of the painting or the safe until Warren stepped out into the hallway, and the office door swung almost but not entirely shut behind him, and Devlin heard the conversation was going to take a while, and he looked at the safe. it was open. Not ajar, open. The door swung out at a 45-degree angle, and from where Devlin was sitting, he could see the interior clearly. Stacked ledgers, 3 or 4 of them, at least bound in dark cloth, with dates written on the spines in a hand that was precise and deliberate. And in front of the ledgers open, the one Warren had apparently been consulting before he stepped out, its pages, visible columns of names and numbers and dates written in the same careful hand. Devlin had not moved from his chair for the first 4 minutes. He knew what he was looking at. He understood what it was. He understood also that the fact that he was looking at it was not something Warren intended, that the open safe was an oversight, a momentary lapse in the tight operational control that Warren Goss maintained over every aspect of his business. Devlin understood all of this clearly and sat perfectly still with his hands in his lap. Then he saw the name. A name he recognized, second column from the left near the top of the open page. A name he knew from the local news from a story he had read 8 months ago about a law enforcement appointment. A name that did not belong in a ledger, in a loan shark safe, next to a dollar amount and a date. He pulled out his phone. He told Rex this part carefully, watching Rex's face for the reaction that didn't come, the face staying level and attentive. He hadn't planned it. He had made the decision in approximately 4 seconds, the way all the decisions in this stretch of his life had been made not from strategy, but from some instinct operating below the level of conscious thought. Some part of him that understood that what he was looking at was the only leverage that existed. And that leverage, even leverage he didn't know how to use, was better than nothing. 11 photographs. He took them from his chair without standing, without touching the safe, without moving anything. Then he put the phone back in his pocket and put his hands back in his lap and was sitting exactly where he had been sitting when Warren Goss came back into the office 2 minutes later. He had kept the photographs on his phone for 6 months. He had looked at them twice in that time. He had not shown them to anyone. He had not used them, had not threatened Warren with them, had not made any move that would have revealed their existence. He had simply held them the way a man held something fragile and dangerous, carefully and very still, because he didn't know what else to do with them. Rex listened to all of this without interrupting. When Devlin finished, Rex looked at the phone on the table between them. "Show me," Rex said. Devlin unlocked the phone. He opened the photographs and slid the phone across the table. Rex looked at the first image. He looked at it for a long time, the way he looked at things he was taking in completely rather than scanning. Then he scrolled to the second, the third. He moved through all 11 photographs with the same unhurried attention, the same stillness, not reacting to any individual image, but absorbing the whole of what he was seeing. When he reached the last photograph, he looked at it for slightly longer than the others. Then he set the phone face down on the table. He was quiet for a moment. "How long were you in that office alone?" he asked. 11 minutes, Devlin said. "I counted." Rex nodded slowly. He picked up his own phone and dialed Frank Calder's number a second time. Frank answered on the first ring. "There's more," Rex said. "Photographs, 11 of them. Come prepared." A pause on the line. "How much more?" Rex looked at Devlin's phone face down on the table between them. "Enough to change what tonight becomes," Rex said. He hung up and set his phone back on the table. "Frank will be here in less than 40 minutes, he said. Caleb, who had been sitting beside Devlin through all of it, with the tight, coiled quality of a man who had committed to staying, but hadn't entirely committed to trusting, said, "Who is Frank Calder?" "An attorney," Rex said. "He spent 12 years working predatory lending cases. He's taken 3 of them to federal court. He's won 2 of those 3. Rex looked at Caleb directly. He is not going to be surprised by anything in those photographs. And he is not going to use them in any way that doesn't serve your interests, in the interests of the people in that ledger." "We don't know what's in the ledger," Caleb said. "You saw it," Rex said to Devlin. "You saw the pages. Tell me what you remember." Devlin pressed his palms flat on the table again, the gesture Rex had come to recognize as the thing he did when he was accessing something difficult, the physical act of steadying himself before retrieving something painful. He remembered names. More than he had realized, he remembered in the way that the mind sometimes preserved things it had been trying to forget, storing them in perfect detail precisely because the instruction to forget them had kept them active rather than allowing them to fade. He had been trying to forget that ledger for 6 months. He had not succeeded. He named 8 people, ordinary names, people's names, the names of people who lived in Flagstaff in the surrounding area, and who had presumably come to warn Goss the way Devlin had come, out of options, out of time, looking for a bridge that turned out to be a trap. Some of them Devlin recognized from the community, from the neighborhood, from the peripheral social knowledge that accumulated in a person without their noticing. An older woman, a man who ran a small contracting business, someone who had been a teacher. And then the name that wasn't like the other names. Rex watched Devlin's face change as he approached it. The other names had come out with a kind of exhausted fluency, the recitation of a man who had been carrying a list he wished he didn't have. But this name arrived differently. Devlin slowed down. His jaw tightened. He looked at Rex as if checking that Rex was prepared for what was coming. Dale Morrow, Devlin said. Rex said nothing. He held his expression exactly where it was, which took a specific kind of effort that he had developed over decades of sitting in rooms where showing your reaction to information was a liability. There was a number next to his name, Devlin said, a dollar amount, and a date from about a year ago. He paused. It wasn't structured like the borrower entries. It was in a different column. Rex looked at him. What column? Devlin's jaw worked. The one on the far right, the one I couldn't read all of, but the header at the top of the column. He stopped. Tell me, Rex said. It said retained, Devlin said. The words sat in the diner like something physical. From the table near the jukebox, Colt said absolutely nothing. He was looking at his hands on the table, and his face had the quality of a man making very deliberate choices about what to do with information that had just substantially rearranged his understanding of a situation. Hank Dillard had put his phone on the table in front of him face up and was looking at it with the focused look of a man who had already begun to think about what to search for and in what order. Rex said, "How many names were in that column?" "I saw 3, Devlin said. "Maybe 4. I only had 11 minutes. Rex looked at the phone, then he looked at Devlin, then very carefully, as if the question needed to be introduced to the room before it was asked, "Dale Morrow, what do you know about him?" Caleb made a sound, short, humorless. "He's on the State Judiciary Oversight Committee." Rex let that sit for 1 second. "He chairs it," Hank said from the jukebox table. He had been looking at his phone for 3 minutes, typing and scrolling with the quiet efficiency of a man conducting research rather than browsing. He didn't look up. "Has for 2 years. I'm looking at his official biography right now." A pause. "He controls which judicial misconduct complaints get investigated and which ones get shelved. He determines which cases involving law enforcement go to review and which ones disappear." Another pause, slightly longer. "There was a federal inquiry into predatory lending in Flagstaff County 18 months ago. It was closed. The investigator was reassigned. The case files were—" He stopped, found the word, misrouted. Nobody said anything. Rex looked at the camera above the coffee machine. It was the second time he had looked at it tonight, and like the first time, no one in the room was paying attention to where his gaze was directed. "That explains some things," Rex said. Caleb was on his feet. Not dramatically, not with sudden motion, but with the contained urgency of a man who had been sitting still through a situation that had been growing steadily more complicated and had now arrived at a point of complexity that he hadn't been prepared for when he walked through the door. He was standing beside the booth, not toward the door, but standing, and his voice had an edge to it that was different from the earlier aggression. This was fear. Real fear. Not of Rex, not of the room, but of what the room had just become. If Goss has the man who chairs the Judiciary Oversight Committee in his pocket, Caleb said, then we are not just looking at a loan shark. We are looking at something that runs through the system. And if we go to any attorney and that attorney makes one phone call to one wrong person. He stopped himself. We walked in here with guns. Our names are going to be in someone's system by morning. And if Goss has people who can see that system, Caleb Rex said. The name came out level and quiet, the same tone Rex used for everything. Not sharp, not a command, just a voice that cut through noise by being the stillest thing in the room. Caleb stopped. Your name is already in this room, Rex said. Devlin's too. You've been here for 25 minutes and there are 9 people who've heard everything you've said. Rex looked at him steadily. Running doesn't change that. It just takes away the only option that actually changes anything. Caleb looked at the room. The truckers at the counter sitting patient and still. The older man by the window. Connie standing near the booth now, arms folded, chin slightly lifted. The young couple still in their booth watching with the wide, careful attention of people who had stopped being afraid and started paying attention. He looked at Colt and Hank and Sal. Then he sat back down. He sat down the way men sat down when they had looked at all the directions available to them and found that the least bad one was the one they were already in. Not with resolution, not with acceptance, but with the exhausted practicality of someone who had run the math and arrived at the only answer that was still standing. Rex's phone rang. Not from Frank, incoming, and not Frank's number. Rex looked at the screen. Then he looked at Devlin. Is this the number he calls from? Rex said, holding the phone toward Devlin. Devlin looked at the screen. Every trace of color left his face. It was 12:47 in the morning. Yes, Devlin said. Rex looked at him for one moment. Not a long moment. Not a dramatic one. Just long enough to see that Devlin understood what was being considered and was not objecting to it. Answer it, Rex said. Speaker. Devlin picked up the phone. His hands had started shaking again. He pressed the green button and set the phone flat on the table between them, and the sound of a man's voice filled the booth. Warren Goss's voice was not what most people expected from a man who operated the kind of machinery that he operated. It was not loud, it was not rough. It was measured and calm and controlled in the way that control sounded when it had been practiced for a long time and had become second nature, not the control of a man suppressing something, but the control of a man for whom suppression was so habitual it had become indistinguishable from his natural register. Devlin, the voice said. One word. The name delivered with the quality of someone who used names as instruments rather than identifiers. Not greeting. Assessment. Yeah, Devlin said. His voice was steady, just barely but steady. It's late, Warren said. You're not home. Not a question. A statement. The statement of a man who had some way of knowing or who was projecting the certainty of knowing as a tactic, or who simply operated at a frequency where the distinction between knowing and claiming to know had been rendered irrelevant by the fact that the person on the other end believed it either way. Rex sat with his hands flat on the table and watched Devlin's face and listened. I'm out, Devlin said. I can see that. A pause, brief, deliberate, the pause of a man who understood the weight of silence in a conversation. Friday is 4 days from now. I want to make sure we're aligned on that. We're aligned, Devlin said. Good. Another pause. You know what I need and you know what happens to the people who can't deliver what I need. You've had a long time to think about Kenny Hartwell. The voice was completely pleasant, conversational. The pleasantness of someone who had found that pleasantness was more effective than menace, that a threat delivered warmly landed deeper than one delivered with heat. How's he doing, by the way, I always wonder. Rex watched something move through Devlin's face that he couldn't fully name. Not anger, not exactly. Something older and harder than anger. The look of a man staring directly at the source of a damage done to someone he knew and having to maintain a neutral surface while looking at it. I don't know, Devlin said. No, Warren said. I suppose you don't. Friday, Devlin, all of it. A beat. Get some sleep. The call ended. The silence that followed it was the heaviest silence of the night. It had a different quality than the silence after the guns, different from the silence when Devlin had first named the debt. This was the silence of a room that had just heard a real thing in real time, not reported or described or filtered through memory. A man's voice lived in the present tense, delivering a threat wrapped in courtesy and confirmed by the name of a 29-year-old who walked with a cane. Now I know what we're dealing with, Rex said. He said it quietly to no one in particular, and it was not a reaction to fear, and it was not a performance of calm. It was a man receiving information and filing it accurately. Nothing more. He looked at the camera above the coffee machine. The third time tonight. Still no one in the room noticed. Connie had moved to the counter and was doing something with her hands that looked like straightening things that didn't need to be straightened. The physical displacement of someone who had just heard something that required movement as a response. She was not crying. She was not making any sound. But her jaw was set in the way Rex recognized after 11 years, the way Connie's jaw set when she was angry and choosing not to express it directly. One of the truckers at the counter, the older one with the weathered face, and the settled patience of a man who had covered a great many miles and heard a great many things, turned slightly on his stool. He didn't say anything, but his posture had shifted, the barely perceptible shift of a man who has decided something. Rex looked back at Devlin. "You've been holding those photographs for 6 months," Rex said. "Yes. And you never used them because I didn't know what to use them for," Devlin said. His voice was very quiet. "I didn't know who was safe. I didn't know who Goss had and who he didn't. I didn't know if the person I went to would be the person who told him I'd come." He looked at his hands. "I kept thinking there had to be something I could do, some way out that didn't require trusting someone I couldn't verify. And tonight?" Devlin looked up at him. His eyes were dry, but the effort of keeping them that way was visible in the set of his face, the subtle tension around his jaw and temples. "Tonight I ran out of things I could do alone." Rex held his gaze. Frank Calder arrived at 1:41 in the morning. He came through the front door with the energy of a man who had spent his career being called at inconvenient hours and had made his peace with it so thoroughly that inconvenience had long since stopped registering. He was compact, early 60s, wearing a jacket grabbed in a hurry over a sweater, carrying a leather bag that moved with the weight of a man who brought everything he might need because he had learned that predicting what he would need was less reliable than simply bringing it all. He stopped inside this door, took in the room with the comprehensive attention of a man trained by long practice to read a situation before entering it. The bikers, the truckers, Connie, the young couple, the older man, Rex in his booth, and across from Rex, 2 young men in work clothes with the look of people who had come through something significant and were not yet on the other side of it. He walked directly to Rex's booth. He sat down. He looked at Devlin. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the small spiral-bound waitress pad on the table that Connie had brought without being asked, a pen on top of it, already placed near Devlin's hands. Then he looked at Rex. "Tell me," he said. Rex told him. It took 14 minutes. Frank listened without interrupting, which was the mark of a man who had heard a great many things over a great many years and understood that listening without commentary was itself a form of professional skill, that a man who interrupted testimony was more interested in his own reactions than in the facts he was receiving. When Rex finished, Frank looked at the phone on the table. "The photographs," Frank said. "Show me." Devlin unlocked the phone and slid it across to Frank. Frank looked at each image with the deliberate, systematic attention of a man who was not looking for his reaction, but for his assessment. He moved through all 11 without speaking. When he reached the last one, he held it for a moment longer. Then he set the phone down. "Devlin," he said, and his voice had the careful, precise quality of a man choosing words that were simultaneously honest and exact. "I need to ask you something, and this is the room where you tell the truth, not the version that sounds better, the actual truth." Devlin said, "Okay." "Did anyone know you took these?" "No." "Did you touch the ledger, open it, turn pages, handle it in any way?" "No, I photographed it from the chair. The door was already open." Frank was quiet for a moment. "Chain of custody is going to be challenged. The manner of acquisition is going to be challenged. I won't pretend otherwise. But as a roadmap, as a foundation for a warrant application, he paused, choosing the next word with the precision of a man who understood what words did in legal proceedings. This is more than I've walked into a U.S. attorney's office with on cases that went all the way. Caleb said, "What does that mean?" "It means," Frank said, "that if these photographs are what they appear to be, and if the name you mentioned is in the column you described, then this is not a predatory lending case." He looked at Rex. "This is a RICO case, racketeering, corruption, obstruction of justice. Federal jurisdiction supersedes whatever protection Goss has built locally." The word federal moved through the room. Devlin said, "Dale Morrow." Frank looked at him directly. "Say the full name and the context again. I want to hear it exactly as you remember it." Devlin said it. The name, the column, the header. "Retained." Frank picked up his pen. He wrote something on the notepad. Then he wrote something else. Then he sat for a moment with the pen hovering above the page and said in a voice addressing the room more than any specific person, "There was a federal inquiry into predatory lending practices in this county 18 months ago. I was aware of it peripherally. It was closed without resolution. The investigator was reassigned. The case files were," he chose the word, "misrouted." Caleb made a sound. "Dale Morrow chairs the State Judiciary Oversight Committee," Frank said. "He has for 2 years. He controls which complaints get investigated and which ones don't. He determines which cases involving law enforcement receive review and which ones are tabled." Frank stopped, set his pen down, picked it up again. He was the deciding vote on the panel that closed the predatory lending inquiry. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, a truck passed on the highway, its sound rising and peaking and gone in 10 seconds. And in the silence it left behind, the diner felt very still and very specific, the way places felt in moments that would be remembered. "He's not just protection," Rex said. He said it quietly, working it through as he spoke. "He's the reason no one Goss has ever bought has faced any consequences. He's the architecture." Frank looked at him. Something in the attorney's face had shifted, not quite surprise, but the recalibration of a man whose map of a situation had been redrawn and who was now looking at a different terrain than the one he had arrived expecting to navigate. "Where did you get this information?" Frank asked. "Hank," Rex said. Frank looked at Hank Dillard at the jukebox table. Hank set his phone in front of Frank without being asked. Frank read it. He scrolled, slowly reading with the care of a man who understood that what he was reading would determine what he did next, and that what he did next mattered. He read for a long time. Then he set the phone down and looked at Rex, and in 12 years of knowing each other, Rex had never seen Frank Calder's face carry that exact look. Not quite surprise, not fear. Something adjacent to both the face of a man who had spent a career handling complicated situations and had just walked into one that was significantly more complicated than he had estimated. 3 shell companies in Nevada, Frank said. $218,000 in campaign contributions to Morrow over 4 years. All from companies that dissolved within months of the contribution or filed no subsequent business activity. He was quiet. "This is publicly available." "All of it," Hank said. "I just put it in one place." Frank said, "Nobody put it in one place before." Not a question. An acknowledgement of something that happens sometimes in investigations where all the pieces were technically visible and nobody had looked at them together, and then someone did. Devlin said very quietly, "Can you protect us?" Frank looked at him. He gave the question the honest consideration it deserved, the consideration of a man who understood that answering correctly required accuracy rather than comfort. "If you cooperate fully," Frank said, "if everything you've told Rex and everything you've told me is complete and verifiable, and if the investigation goes where these photographs suggest it should go, then yes, there are provisions, whistleblower protections, cooperation agreements. The path exists." He looked at both of them in turn. "It is not easy, it is not fast, but it is a real path." A pause. "The alternative is Friday morning." Devlin looked at Caleb. Caleb was looking at the table. He had been quiet for the last several minutes. Not the coiled quiet of a man containing aggression, but the quieter quiet of a man thinking, working something through in the way that men sometimes work things through when they had finally stopped running fast enough to think clearly. He looked up. "The man on my porch," Devlin said suddenly. He said it as if the thought had surfaced on its own. "When he came to the house, I didn't know who he was. He came in Goss's car, he spoke for Goss, but I never got a name." He stopped, his jaw tightened. He looked at my house. He looked at where Lily's bedroom window was. He didn't say anything about it. He just looked. His voice had gone very flat. "I want his name in the record, whatever record there is. I want that in it." Frank wrote it down without being asked. He wrote it in his compressed, precise hand, the hand of a man who knew exactly what that kind of testimony was worth. "It will be," Frank said. Devlin nodded. The same decisive nod that Rex had seen once before tonight, the movement that meant a decision had been made and would not be revisited. "Then we do it," Devlin said. Caleb looked at him for a long moment. Something moved between them in that look, the compressed language of men who had known each other for a long time and had developed a communication that operated below the level of words. Whatever it said, Caleb received it. He looked at Frank. "All of it," Caleb said. "We tell you everything." Frank uncapped his pen. Over the next hour, Devlin and Caleb talked. Frank wrote, Rex listened. Occasionally, Rex asked a question that redirected the conversation toward the specific, a name, a date, a dollar amount, the kind of detail that an attorney needed and that a story required to become a case. And each time he asked, he kept his voice level and his questions plain. The questions of a man who wanted facts and trusted that facts were what they were, regardless of how they were delivered. The names that came out in that hour were the names from the ledger and the names adjacent to it, the names of people Devlin and Caleb knew had been in Goss's waiting room. People from their neighborhood and their community who had arrived at the pawn shop the same way Devlin had arrived out of options looking for a bridge. An older woman named Ruth Halsey, who had been in the waiting room when Devlin arrived for his first meeting. She had been crying quietly, trying not to show it, the compressed grief of a woman who had spent a long time being strong and was running out of the resource that strength required. Devlin had never spoken to her. He didn't know her name then. He had learned it later through the peripheral way that information moved through a community, through the accumulated knowledge of a neighborhood that knew its own. A man named Garrett Fowles, who ran a small electrical contracting business and whose truck Devlin had seen parked outside the pawn shop 3 times in the space of a month, who had eventually stopped answering his phone and closed the business. And Kenny Hartwell. Kenny Hartwell, whose name Warren Goss had said on the phone 40 minutes ago, with the conversational ease of a man referencing a useful example, the way you invoked a fact whose purpose was not to inform but to remind. Who walked with a cane at 29 because a hit and run that wasn't a hit and run had done something to his right hand that the doctor said would probably be permanent. Rex listened to Kenny Hartwell's name move through the room a second time and did what he had done the first time, held it, let it become fully real, did not use his face to show what it did to him. But something in him registered it with the weight it deserved, the weight of a specific injustice carried out against a specific person, a man who had a name and a history, and a before and an after, and the after was defined by what Warren Goss's operation had decided to do to him for the crime of running out of money. At 2:53 in the morning, Frank capped his pen. He had filled both sides of 17 pages of the spiral-bound waitress pad. He set the pen on top of the pad and looked at Devlin and Caleb for a long moment, the assessment of a man who had spent 12 years in rooms with people who were being honest with him and people who were not, and had developed a reliable sense of the difference. "I'm going to make a call," Frank said. "First thing in the morning before 7, there's a federal attorney in Phoenix who I have worked with on 2 previous cases. She is not connected to the county judiciary in any way, and she is not connected to Morrow's committee, and she has clearance at a level that insulates this from anything the local system could reach." He looked at Rex. "The photographs need to go with me tonight." Rex nodded. "Devlin," Frank said, "the phone stays in my custody from this moment. Not because I don't trust you, because chain of custody begins now, and every hour those photographs spend outside of documented custody is an hour that a defense attorney will use." He held out his hand. Devlin looked at the phone. He had carried it for 6 months. He had carried the weight of what was on it for 6 months. The terrible specific weight of knowing something that you didn't know how to use, that you couldn't tell anyone, that lived in your pocket like a piece of evidence at a trial you didn't know how to call. He picked it up. He held it for a moment. Then he placed it in Frank's hand. Frank stood. He put the phone in his leather bag. He looked at Rex, and in the look was the compressed communication of two men who had known each other through difficult rooms and understood what they were currently standing in. "Don't go home," Frank said to Devlin and Caleb. "Either of you. Tonight you're coming with me. I have a secure office and a phone that doesn't go through any exchange that Goss's people can access." He picked up the notepad. "And tomorrow morning, I'm going to make a call that starts something that none of us are going to be able to stop once it starts." He looked at both young men. "You need to understand that." "I understand it," Devlin said. "So do I," Caleb said. Frank walked toward the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at Rex. He had the look of a man carrying something too large and too important to put down, and who had accepted that the carrying was going to continue for some time. "I'll call you when I have something," Frank said. "I'll be here," Rex said. Frank went out. The bell above the door chimed. Devlin and Caleb followed. The bell chimed again, then the sound of a car starting in the parking lot, headlights sweeping briefly across the window and then gone. Rex sat in his booth. The diner had the quality of a room in which something had just completed one stage and not yet begun. The next, the held breath quality of an interval. Connie was behind the counter. The truckers were at the counter. The older gentleman was still by the window. The young couple had moved imperceptibly closer together in their booth, leaning into each other with the gravity of people who had been through something and were processing it in the way people process things when there was no adequate language for them. Hank came to Rex's table. He sat down at the end of the booth, not across, not presuming Devlin's seat, just at the end. He set his phone face down on the table. "There's more," Hank said. Rex looked at him. "I kept digging after I showed Frank the contributions," Hank said. "Morrow's committee, the 18-month-old inquiry, the investigator who was reassigned." He paused. "The investigator filed a formal complaint about the reassignment. It's public record. The complaint was reviewed by the Oversight Committee," Rex said. "Chaired by Morrow," Hank said. Rex looked at the camera above the coffee machine. He looked at it for a long moment, and then he looked at Hank, and then he looked at the table. "He's not just protected," Rex said. "He's the protection." "Yes," Hank said. "And the protection thinks it's permanent." Hank said nothing. He didn't need to. Both men understood what permanent protection looked like and what it eventually did to the men who believed in it. They had watched it in other forms, in other contexts, in the way that power, when it believed itself to be without consequence, eventually overcorrected in some direction and left a seam exposed. Rex picked up his coffee cup. Cold again. He drank it. Outside on Route 89, the night was doing what the high desert did. In the hours before the sky changed, going completely quiet. The silence of a place that had shed its daytime traffic and arrived at something older and deeper. The silence of elevation and distance. The silence that had been there before the highway and would be there after. Rex sat in his corner booth and thought about a ledger in a safe in a pawn shop on the south side of Flagstaff. He thought about 11 photographs on a phone that was now in Frank Calder's leather bag in a car heading toward Phoenix. He thought about Warren Goss's voice on a speaker in the middle of a diner, pleasant and controlled, saying a man's name as a reminder of what consequences look like. He thought about Lily Mercer, 4 years old, who went to preschool now and came home with paint on her hands. He thought about the camera above the coffee machine. Then his phone buzzed. A text from Frank sent from the car less than 4 minutes after leaving. 4 words. She's answering. "We're good." Rex read it twice, set the phone down, looked at Hank. Frank's making the call tonight, Rex said. Hank nodded once. He had been expecting this and was glad to have it confirmed. Rex looked at the camera one more time. Then he looked at his empty coffee cup. Connie, he said. She was already coming with the pot. The FBI arrived at 6:14 in the morning. Not one agent, three. Rex Harlow was still in the corner booth when they came through the door. He had not left, had not slept, had drunk somewhere between 8 and 10 cups of coffee by that point, and was operating on the particular clear-headed exhaustion that came from a night when too much had happened to permit the ordinary shutdown of the mind. Not tiredness so much as a sustained, unusual clarity, the way the air felt after a storm had moved through and taken everything loose with it. Colt had fallen asleep in his chair sometime around 4:30. His arms were folded on the table and his head was down, and he was breathing with the deep regularity of a large man who had decided that sleep was available and had taken it without ceremony. Nobody had woken him. Sal had gone outside twice to make phone calls he hadn't explained and Rex hadn't asked about. Hank had been on his phone for most of 3 hours, moving between reading and occasional short texts, sent with the focused economy of a man conducting research he wasn't going to summarize until he had something complete. Connie was still there. She should not have been. Her shift had ended at midnight 6 hours ago, and no one had suggested she leave, and she had not offered to. Sometime around 4 in the morning, she had made herself a cup of tea and sat down at the counter with it, and she had stayed, and the staying was its own kind of statement. The statement of a woman who had been in this room when something happened and had decided that she was not leaving until she understood how it ended. The two truckers had gone sometime after 3. The older one had placed a hand briefly on Rex's shoulder as he passed, not stopping, not speaking, just the hand for 2 seconds, and then gone, the gesture of a man who had sat through something and wanted to mark it without making a production of it. The younger one had paused at the door and looked back at the room for a moment with an expression that Rex had filed away without being able to immediately classify, and then he had left without explanation. Rex had not gotten their names. He thought about that occasionally in the months that followed. The older gentleman with the newspaper had left sometime around 2, placing a folded 20 on the table beside his cup, significantly more than his coffee cost, and walking out with a small, wordless nod to Rex that Rex returned. The young couple had slipped out quietly during Frank's visit, sliding out of their booth and going through the door while everyone else was focused on the conversation at the corner table. Rex had noticed them go, but hadn't interrupted what he was doing to acknowledge it. So when the front door chimed at 6:14, the diner held Rex in his booth, Hank at his table, Sal near the jukebox, Colt asleep, and Connie at the counter with her tea. The sky outside had begun to change, not sunrise yet, but the first suggestion of it, the darkness thinning at the eastern edge into something that was not quite night and not quite morning. The agent in front was a woman. Early 40s, brown hair pulled back, wearing a jacket over dark slacks, with the absence of self-consciousness that came from people who had long since stopped thinking about how they appeared in rooms and had replaced that attention entirely with focus on the rooms themselves. She was carrying a leather bag over one shoulder, heavy with the weight of someone who brought everything and decided what was relevant later. Her 2 colleagues came in behind her, both men, both younger, moving to positions in the room without being directed, the practiced, unobtrusive quality of people trained to be present without dominating. She stopped inside the door. She looked at the diner the way Rex looked at rooms, comprehensively quickly, the total intake of a trained observer. She looked at Hank. She looked at Colt. She looked at Connie behind the counter. She looked at the camera above the coffee machine. She held it for a fraction of a second longer than the other things she looked at. Then she looked at Rex. "Mr. Harlow," she said. "Rex," he said. She walked to his booth. She sat down across from him in the seat where Devlin Mercer had sat 8 hours ago, where Frank Calder had sat 4 hours ago, where the night had accumulated its weight through the succession of people who had occupied that space and what each of them had brought to it. "Agent Sandra Keene," she said. "FBI Phoenix Financial Crimes Unit. Frank Calder sends his regards." A pause. "He also says you make better coffee than he does, which I intend to verify." Connie was already moving from behind the counter with the pot. Keen accepted the cup with a nod of acknowledgement and wrapped both hands around it. And for a moment, she simply looked at Rex with the assessing attention of a professional evaluating something she had been told about and was now comparing to the original. "I've read Frank's preliminary briefing," she said, "and I've listened to the call recording he sent at 3:40 this morning." A brief pause. "Warren Goss has a distinctive voice." "He does," Rex said. "I want to ask you something directly before we get into the formal process." She held his gaze. "Frank described how you handled the situation last night, the way you responded when two armed men walked through that door." She set her cup down. "Most people don't respond that way. Most people hit the floor and wait. How did you know those two men were not going to hurt anyone?" Rex looked at her steadily. "Most people haven't spent 39 years reading people in rooms where the stakes were high." That's a diplomatic answer. It's an honest one. She studied him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted slightly. Someone updating an assessment. Then she gave a small, compressed nod and moved on. "The security camera," she said. She looked at it again, the one above the coffee machine. "We're going to need the footage." Rex looked at Connie. Connie looked at Keen. "The system is owned by the diner," Connie said. "Records to a hard drive in the back office. I can show you." "The diner is mine," Rex said. "Has been for 11 years. Keen looked at him. Something shifted in her expression again, a second update in quick succession. "Frank didn't mention that," she said. "Frank doesn't know everything about me," Rex said. "Just enough." "Can we access the footage?" "You can have all of it," Rex said. "Everything from last night and whatever prior recordings are still on the drive. If Goss's people have come through here before, there's a chance they're on that footage. I want to know if they are." Keen set her cup down. She looked at him with the attention of someone who was revising their understanding of a situation in real time, who had come in with one map and was now holding a different one. "You've been thinking about this all night," she said. "I've had time," Rex said. One of the agents at the counter pulled out a laptop without being asked. He looked at Keen, who gave a small nod, and he stood and walked toward the back office with Connie leading the way. Keen looked at Hank Dillard, who had been sitting at the adjacent table, with his phone face down, waiting with the patient stillness of a man who had been in rooms with federal agents before and understood the protocol. "Mr. Dillard," Keen said without preamble, without explaining how she knew his name. Frank's briefing had clearly been thorough. "Frank mentioned you found something on Morrow last night." Hank picked up his phone. He placed it on the table in front of Keen without speaking. She looked at the screen. She scrolled. She read for a long time, cross-referencing what Hank had assembled against things she already knew and things she was only now learning. Her jaw tightened once. A single brief contraction, barely visible, gone immediately. But Rex saw it. She set the phone down. "Where did you find this?" she said to Hank. "Public records," Hank said. "County finance filings, zoning approvals, judicial appointment confirmations, campaign contribution disclosures." He folded his hands on the table. "It's all available. Nobody put it together in one place." "Nobody put it together in one place," Keen repeated. She said it in the tone of someone confirming something rather than expressing surprise. She looked at the ceiling briefly, just the gesture of a person letting a large piece of information find its place in a structure that already existed and finding that it fit exactly where it should. "The inquiry 18 months ago," Rex said. "The predatory lending investigation that was closed. The investigator who was reassigned. The case files that were misrouted." He kept his voice level. "Morrow chaired the vote to shelve it." "I'm aware of the inquiry," Keen said. "I was peripherally involved in the early stages before it was transferred to the county level." She paused. "What I was not aware of until Frank called me at 3 this morning was the connection between Morrow and Goss through the shell companies." She looked at the notepad in front of her. "Combined with what's on those photographs, we have a thread." She looked at Rex directly. "I intend to pull it." From the back office, the sound of the younger agent's voice, low and professional, speaking into a phone. A pause. Then footsteps, and the agent came back out and leaned toward Keene and said something quiet that Rex couldn't fully hear from the booth. Keene's expression didn't change, but she sat up slightly, the barely perceptible adjustment of a person receiving information that required a physical response even when the face declined to provide one. "How much?" she asked. "All of it," the agent said. 48 hours rolling, high resolution." He paused. "Audio capture." The room processed that. Connie had come back from the back office and was standing near the counter. She turned when she heard the word audio. "The newer systems record both," the agent said, "if the owner specified audio capture during installation." "I did," Rex said. He said it without particular emphasis. Matter of fact, the way he said most things. A fact among facts. Sal, who had come back inside at some point without anyone particularly noting his return, said from near the jukebox, "Rex." Just the one word, the check-in. The same check-in he had given twice the night before, meaning the same thing each time. "Are you sure about this?" "Security," Rex said, simply, not to Sal, specifically to the room. "When you own a place on a highway and you're known, you want a record. You want it always." He looked at Keene. "Whatever's on that audio, you have it." Keene looked at the camera above the coffee machine. She looked at it with the focused attention of someone recalculating the evidentiary value of what she had been told she was receiving and arriving at a number significantly higher than her original estimate. Then she looked at Rex. "Do you understand what's on that recording?" she said. "I have a general idea," Rex said. "I mean specifically." She leaned forward slightly. "Everything that was said last night, every name, every detail about the ledger. Devlin Mercer's testimony essentially in full in context in his own voice." She held his gaze. "And the phone call. Warren Goss's voice on a speaker in a diner identifying himself by the context of the call, referencing Kenny Hartwell by name as a consequence for non-payment." She paused. "That is not a description of a threat. That is the threat recorded, time-stamped, voluntarily received." Rex said nothing. "A defense attorney will challenge the photographs," Keene said. "Chain of custody, manner of acquisition, conditions under which they were taken. All of that is arguable." She picked up her cup. "A contemporaneous audio recording of a voluntary phone call received in a public establishment in the presence of multiple witnesses is substantially harder to challenge." Rex picked up his own cup. "You kept redirecting the conversation," Keene said. "Not an accusation. An observation delivered with the neutrality of someone simply naming what she had found. Frank noted it in his briefing. Every time the conversation drifted toward the general, you brought it back. Names, dates, dollar amounts, the ledger, the safe, the column header." She held his gaze. "You were building a record." Rex drank his coffee, set it down. "I told you," he said. "I've had time to think." Keene looked at him for a long moment. Then she said with the small, compressed version of something that was probably the closest she allowed herself to a smile in a professional context, "Frank said you were an unusual man." "Frank's been saying that for 12 years, Rex said. "Is he right?" Rex considered it briefly. "He's accurate," Rex said. "Whether that's unusual depends on who you're comparing me to." Keene set her cup down. She looked at the notepad in front of her, at the things she had written and the things she was still processing, and then she looked at Rex with the directness of a professional who had finished the evaluative portion of the conversation and was ready to move to the operational portion. "I'm going to tell you what happens next," she said, "and then I'm going to need something from you." "Go ahead," Rex said. "The warrant application is going in front of a federal judge this morning. Based on the photographs and the audio recording and the shell company documentation, the application will be approved, probably within 2 hours of submission." She looked at her watch. "The submission happens when I leave here." "The pawn shop," Rex said. "The pawn shop," Keene confirmed. "Goss is the primary target. What comes out of that safe determines the scope of what follows." She paused. "But based on what's already in front of me, the connection between Goss and Morrow, the pattern of judicial suppression over 9 years, the shell company contributions." Another pause, slightly longer. Dale Morrow will not be chairing anything by the end of this week. The words landed in the diner with a weight that required a moment before anyone responded to it. Not because it was unexpected. Rex had been moving toward this conclusion since Hank had shown him the phone screen at 3 in the morning, but because there was always a distance between understanding that something was true and hearing it stated plainly by a federal agent in the morning light. Colt woke up. He lifted his head from his folded arms and looked around the room with the immediate, unself-conscious orientation of a man who had been in enough situations to wake up alert rather than confused. He took in Keene, the other agents, the laptop on the counter, Rex's face. He said nothing. He folded his hands on the table and listened. "What I need from you," Keene said to Rex, "is documented consent for the footage. The formal chain of custody begins with your signature on a federal evidence receipt. Your attorney should be present for that, but given that your attorney is currently in Phoenix with 2 cooperative witnesses, we can proceed with a witness verbal consent and formalize the paperwork within 24 hours. You have my consent," Rex said, "verbal and otherwise." Keene nodded. She looked at the agent who had come back from the back office. He was already setting up the documentation on his laptop. "Devlin and Caleb," Rex said. "Frank has the cooperation agreement in draft form," Keene said. "It will be formalized once we confirm the contents of the safe. But the framework is there." She met Rex's eyes. "They cooperated fully and voluntarily. The recording supports that comprehensively. Their testimony was offered without coercion in complete detail before they had any guarantee of protection." She paused. "That matters significantly." "Devlin has a daughter," Rex said. "She's 4 years old. She just learned to walk again after surgery." Keene looked at him. Something moved in her face. Not unprofessional, not dramatic. Just human, the thing that was underneath the calibrated neutrality and that occasionally in the right moment became briefly visible. "I know," she said. "Frank told me." She picked up her cup. "I have a daughter. She's 7. She looked at the cup. "I listened to the recording on the way here. The part where Devlin talks about Lily in the hospital." She was quiet for a moment. "I heard it." Rex nodded. He didn't say anything because there was nothing to add, and adding something would have diminished it. They sat with that for a moment. Then Frank called. Rex picked up on the second ring. "Warren's coming through." Frank said, his voice carrying the quality of a man who had been awake all night and was running on the compressed, burning energy of someone holding something that couldn't be put down. "Application went in 40 minutes ago. Judge reviewed the photographs and the audio summary. The application will be approved." A pause. "Rex, this is a clean warrant. Chain of custody on the photographs is going to be challenged, but the audio makes the photographs almost secondary. The phone call alone—" "I know," Rex said. "Sandra's there." "She is." "Good." A brief pause. "Devlin and Caleb are both still here. Both steady. Devlin slept for 2 hours on the office couch. Caleb didn't sleep, but he's holding." Frank's voice shifted slightly. "Rex, when this breaks publicly, and it will break because reporters cover federal courts, and they will see the warrant application, the diner is going to be part of the story. The footage is going to be the center of it." "I understand that." "The audio recording of a voluntary conversation in a private establishment where the owner consented to recording, that's the spine of the evidentiary case. Everything else can be argued. That audio in context with the footage, with Devlin's voice on it, with Goss's voice on it." Frank paused. "People are going to watch this, Rex. A great many people." Rex looked at the camera above the coffee machine. The small, ordinary thing that had been up there for 11 years, recording everything and waiting for the moment it would matter. He thought about Ruth Halsey crying in a waiting room and trying not to show it. He thought about Kenny Hartwell at 29 with a cane and a hand that didn't work right. He thought about Devlin Mercer looking at $250 in a register as if it were the verdict on 8 months of trying to survive. He thought about 400 people who did not yet know that a safe was about to be opened. "Let them watch," Rex said. A silence on the line. Then Frank said, "I'll call when the warrant is confirmed." Rex set the phone down. He looked at Keene. Frank says the warrant is coming through, he said. I know, Keene said. She was already on her own phone the second call of the morning, standing now the energy of someone who had finished the gathering phase and was moving into the operational one. She spoke for 40 seconds and hung up. She looked at her two colleagues. We're moving at confirmation. She looked at Rex one more time. On behalf of the Bureau, she started and then stopped and started again differently, as if the formal language had presented itself and she had looked at it and decided it was the wrong register for what she actually wanted to say. Thank you. What happened in this room last night could have gone a dozen different ways. It went this way because you made specific choices. She met his eyes. That matters. Rex nodded. She walked out. The bell above the door chimed. The two agents followed. The bell chimed again. Then the diner was quiet. Connie came to the booth and sat down across from Rex. She had never in 11 years of working for him sat down across from him in his booth during a shift. They both registered this without commenting on it. The footage is going to go public, she said. When the legal process allows, Rex said. And the part where you told him you could see his hands shaking. She paused. That's on there. Yes. Connie was quiet for a moment. She looked at the camera with the expression she had been wearing for hours, the expression of someone trying to fully comprehend something that kept expanding beyond the frame she was using to contain it. Then she looked at Rex. Were you scared, she said. When Caleb raised the shotgun the second time, when the whole room thought, she stopped, started again. Were you scared? Rex thought about it. He gave it the honesty it deserved. Yes, he said. Connie blinked. She had expected a different answer. I'm 57 years old, Rex said. I've been scared plenty of times. Being scared doesn't mean you move. It means your body is paying attention. He looked at the empty booth across from his, the booth where Devlin had sat. I was scared and I could see he was more scared than I was. A pause. So I stayed still. Connie was quiet for a moment. That's arithmetic, Rex said. She looked at him for a long time. Maybe, she said finally. Maybe it's both. The warrant came through at 9:47. Rex was in the parking lot when Frank texted him. The Arizona sun was doing what the October sun did at that elevation, low and specific and surprisingly warm after the cold of the night, and Rex stood with his face in it for a moment after reading the message, letting the warmth reach him. He had been inside for 9 hours. The warmth was real in the way that things were real after a long night, more present, more physical, carrying more weight than it would have carried if he had simply slept and woken to it. He texted back, confirmed. Frank's response came in 40 seconds. Application approved. Moving now. Rex stood in the parking lot for a while after that. He could hear through the diner's walls the sound of Connie moving inside, the familiar rhythm of a woman who knew her space completely. He could hear Sal's voice low, talking to someone on the phone. He could hear the highway, the permanent background presence of engines and distant people moving through the world in the direction of wherever they were going. Most of them with no knowledge of what had happened the night before in the diner beside the road. He thought about the door opening at 12:17. He thought about setting the coffee cup down. He thought about asking the only question that had mattered. He went back inside. Frank called at 10:41. Rex picked up on the first ring. The safe was open when they entered, Frank said. His voice had a quality Rex had never heard in it before. Not excitement exactly. Frank was too disciplined for excitement, but a kind of sustained intensity, like current moving through a wire at maximum capacity, the voice of a man watching something unfold in real time that he had spent his career working toward. Goss was on premises. He tried to close it when he heard them come in. Didn't make it. Rex said the ledger. In the safe, Frank said, along with 3 additional ledgers that Devlin didn't know existed. A pause, miss. Rex, this is not 64 families. This is not a regional operation. Another pause longer. The additional ledgers cover activity going back 9 years. The preliminary estimate from the agent on scene is somewhere north of 400 individuals across 6 states. Rex set his coffee cup down. He sat with that number. Not the abstraction of it, not the scale of it as a statistic, but what the number represented. 400 people who had walked into a pawn shop on the south side of Flagstaff with a problem they couldn't solve any other way, and had walked out with a trap that had been structured deliberately and carefully to be inescapable. 400 people who had been paying week after week while the numbers grew and the threats arrived and the options narrowed to nothing. 400 people who did not know this morning that the safe had just been opened. Goss is in custody, Rex said. Taken off premises at 10:38, Frank said. Federal holding. Another pause. His attorney, the one he called immediately upon detention, is from the same firm as Dale Morrow's personal attorney. The pause after this one was deliberate, letting a fact land at its proper weight. From an investigation standpoint, that phone call is going to be extremely useful. Rex looked at the camera above the coffee machine. How long before the footage goes public? Rex said. It stays under federal seal through the investigation and trial, Frank said. However, he paused. The audio of a voluntary conversation between private citizens in a private establishment where the owner consented to recording. There are arguments to be made about what portions and under what conditions could eventually be released for public interest purposes. A brief silence. Why? Because people need to see it, Rex said. Not for the case. After the case. People need to see what happened in this room. A long silence. Let me get Goss into federal court first, Frank said. I know, Rex said. I'm not asking for now. I'm asking you to think about eventually. I'm thinking, Frank said. I'll call when there's more. He hung up. Rex told Hank and Sal and Colt what Frank had told him. The four men sat in silence for a moment with the number 406 states and 9 years settled in the air between them. Sal said Kenny Hartwell. I know, Rex said. He's one of the 400 probably. Sal's voice was quiet. He walks with a cane. He's 29 years old and his right hand doesn't work right because Goss had someone break it and he walks with a cane. He looked at the table. I just want to say it out loud. So it said. He looked up. Okay, I'm done. Nobody said anything for a moment. Then Hank's phone buzzed. He read something. His face shifted in the specific way it shifted when information rearranged his understanding of a situation, not dramatically. Just a slight change of a man who had been looking at a picture and had suddenly seen something in it he hadn't seen before. Morrow issued a statement, Hank said, 12 minutes ago, through his office. He read from the screen. He says he has no knowledge of Warren Goss or any predatory lending operation and welcomes any investigation that serves to protect Arizona consumers. He looked up. He also announced that he is voluntarily stepping back from his duties on the Oversight Committee pending a review. The room was quiet. Someone told him, Colt said. His voice carried no surprise, just the flat recognition of a man who had seen this pattern before. Someone in the federal process between midnight and now made a call they shouldn't have made, Hank said, and told Morrow his name was in play. Can they trace it? Sal asked. They will try, Rex said. Connie said from behind the counter, voluntarily stepping back. Everyone looked at her. She had been listening as she had been listening all morning, and she spoke with the directness of someone who had been quiet long enough to think it all the way through. That's not innocence. That's someone trying to control a story before the story controls him. Rex looked at her. 11 years, he thought. Every time. You're right, he said. The statement is going to backfire, Hank said. Federally, you don't voluntarily step back from a committee you chair because of an investigation you claim to know nothing about. You step back because you know exactly what's coming and you're trying to limit the damage. He set his phone down. That statement is going to be in every legal filing from this point forward as evidence of consciousness of guilt. Rex nodded slowly. Then his phone rang. A Phoenix area code he didn't recognize. He answered, Mr. Harlow, a woman's voice, older, careful in the way that careful had become a survival mechanism over a long period of time. My name is Ruth Halsey. I was given this number by a young man named Devlin Mercer. A pause. He said I should call you. He said he thought things might be different now. Her voice dropped. Is that true? Rex straightened in his booth. Mrs. Halsey, he said. Yes, I'm here. She made a sound at the confirmation of his presence, the small involuntary sound of a woman who had been steeling herself for the possibility that the number wouldn't work, that the call would go unanswered, that the thing Devlin had told her would turn out to be another version of hope that didn't hold. Devlin said something happened, she said. He said Warren. Her voice caught. She steadied it with visible effort. He said Warren Goss is in federal custody this morning, Rex said. He said it directly and without preamble because she had been waiting a long time for something direct, and he was not going to make her wait through careful framing to reach the fact. The ledgers from his operation are in federal possession. If your loan is in those ledgers, it is now evidence in a federal investigation, and illegal debt instruments identified in a federal investigation are subject to cancellation proceedings. Silence. Then Ruth Halsey made a sound that Rex Harlow would never fully be able to describe to anyone who asked him about it afterward. It was not a cry, and it was not a laugh, and it was not simply relief. It was the sound a person made when something that had been pressing on them for so long that they had stopped remembering what it felt like not to have it pressing, when that thing suddenly, without warning, was not there anymore. The sudden absence of a weight that had become so familiar, it had started to feel like a permanent part of the architecture of her life. 2 years, she said. She said it the way Devlin had said 8 months. Flat without inflection because the number was too large for inflection. I've been paying him for 2 years. I know, Rex said. Mrs. Halsey, I need you to do something today. Anything, she said immediately and without qualification, the response of a person who had been waiting for someone to tell them there was something they could do. Rex gave her Frank Calder's number from memory. He told her to gather every document she had, every payment receipt, every piece of correspondence from Goss's operation, every statement, and to call Frank today, not tomorrow. He told her Frank was expecting calls. He told her she was not the only person in this situation, and that all of them were going to be heard. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, Devlin said you were something else. Devlin's a good man who got caught in bad machinery, Rex said. That's all. He hung up. He put the phone down and looked at it for a moment. Then he looked at Connie, who had heard every word and whose eyes were doing something she was very deliberately not drawing attention to. He looked at Hank and Sal and Colt, and he picked up his coffee cup. How many more Ruth Halseys are there? Sal said quietly. 400, Rex said. Give or take. Nobody said anything. Frank called 4 more times before noon. First call, Goss had requested an attorney and stopped talking. Second call, the additional ledgers had been transferred to the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Phoenix for processing. Third call, a federal judge had signed a temporary injunction freezing all active collection activity associated with Goss's operation across all 6 states, effective immediately. Fourth call, which Rex took standing in the parking lot again, his face in the October sun. Dale Morrow had retained criminal defense counsel. Rex stood in the parking lot after the fourth call and listened to the highway for a while. The engines in the distance, the ordinary movement of people going somewhere. He thought about a camera above a coffee machine, about 39 years of watching hands, about the question that had mattered most, the question that had not been strategic or rehearsed, that had simply been honest, the only honest question available in that moment. How much trouble are you really in? He had been asking that question his whole life in one form or another. Of every person he had encountered who was presenting one thing while being something else underneath. Of every situation that wore a surface that didn't match the structure beneath it. He had never had a name for it, had never thought of it as a method or a practice. It was just the thing he did. The thing 39 years of watching hands had made natural. He went back inside. The story broke publicly at 2:17 in the afternoon. 3 local television stations had camera crews outside the pawn shop by 11, and the FBI's Phoenix field office confirmed at 2 o'clock with a statement that said federal charges were pending against Warren Goss for racketeering, predatory lending witness, intimidation, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. The statement mentioned activity across 6 states and multiple individuals and described the investigation as ongoing. It did not mention the diner. It did not mention the camera. Not yet. That came 17 days later. Frank had argued correctly that the footage should remain under federal seal through Goss's arraignment. But once the arraignment was complete and the evidentiary framework established, a federal judge approved limited release of a specific portion of the recording for use in the government's public statement on the scope of the investigation. The portion approved for release was 4 minutes and 22 seconds long. It began with the door opening. It ended with Devlin Mercer placing his gun on the table. In between those two moments, it showed everything. The raised weapons in the terrified room and the two truckers going still at the counter. It showed Rex Harlow not moving. It showed Connie frozen with the coffee pot. It showed Rex picking up his cup and drinking from it with a loaded gun in the room and saying in a voice that was flat and unhurried and completely certain of itself, "My hands are busy." Someone posted a 22-second clip to social media. No context, just the location and the date and the moment Rex said, "You still have one good decision left tonight." And the exact moment Caleb Shaw's hand began to shake. And the exact moment the shotgun came down. Within 6 hours, it had been viewed 8 million times. Within 24 hours, 40 million. Within 48 hours, the number had passed 53 million and was still climbing. Rex was specifically and deliberately not reading the comments. He had never been a man who needed to know what strangers thought of him, and he saw no reason to develop the habit now. But Connie read them. She read them at the counter in the quiet hours between the lunch rush, which was for the first time in 11 years an actual rush cars filling the parking lot with people who had driven from Flagstaff and Sedona and Prescott specifically to sit in the booth where it had happened. She read the comments, and occasionally she said nothing, and occasionally she said something short and quiet. "A woman in Ohio," Connie said one afternoon without looking up from her phone. "She says she had a loan like that too. Different city, different man, same machine. She says watching the footage made her feel like someone finally understood what it was like." Rex said nothing. "A veteran in Georgia," Connie said a few minutes later. "He says he almost did something like what Devlin did 2 years ago. He says he doesn't know what stopped him." She paused. "He says he's glad he didn't." Rex said nothing. "A man in Minneapolis," Connie said. She was quiet for a moment. "Then his brother died because of a loan shark. Couldn't pay, and 6 weeks later..." She stopped, set the phone down. "He says he wishes his brother had found a different diner." The diner was quiet for a long moment. "What's the man's name?" Rex said. Connie looked at the phone. "David Kraus." Rex held out his hand. She looked at him for a moment. Then she gave him the phone. He found the comment. He typed a reply. 4 sentences. He handed the phone back. Connie read what he had written. It said, "Your brother's story matters. What happened to him should not have happened. The men responsible for operations like the one that hurt your family are in federal court right now because a young man found the courage to stop. I am sorry for your loss." She looked up. "You signed it," she said. "It's my name," he said. She gave the phone back and went to work. The federal case moved through the court system with the momentum of a case built cleanly before anyone had the opportunity to compromise it. Frank Calder represented 67 of the affected borrowers in the civil proceedings. A federal public defenders coalition took on the remaining cases. By the end of the first month, 112 illegal debt instruments had been flagged for cancellation. By the end of the third month, the number was 291. Dale Morrow was indicted 8 weeks after the raid. 9 counts including bribery, obstruction of justice, and conspiracy to commit racketeering. His voluntary resignation from the Oversight Committee, submitted the morning after the raid, in what he had clearly imagined was a protective gesture, was cited in the indictment as evidence of consciousness of guilt, exactly as Hank had predicted standing in the diner that morning. Devlin Mercer served no prison time. He completed 120 hours of community service at a legal aid clinic that helped families navigate predatory lending situations. And he did it with the particular intensity of a man who understood from the inside exactly what the people he was helping were going through. Caleb Shaw completed a treatment program for the anxiety disorder that had been untreated for most of his adult life, and that had contributed in ways neither he nor anyone else had fully understood at the time to the decisions that had led him to the door of Sunset Junction Diner on a Wednesday night in October. He completed the program. He found work. He was not in the years that followed in any law enforcement database for anything that mattered. Ruth Halsey's debt was among the first to be formally canceled. 2 years and 3 months of payments, every receipt of which she had kept in a shoebox under her bed, were entered into the federal record, and her loan instrument was voided. Frank called her personally to tell her. She was quiet on the phone for a long time, and then she said thank you, and then she cried, and then she apologized for crying, and Frank told her she had absolutely nothing to apologize for. Kenny Hartwell was contacted by federal investigators in month 2. His case, the hit and run that wasn't a hit and run, a hand that didn't work right, the years of walking with a cane at 29, became one of the 6 witness intimidation counts in the expanded indictment. He testified in federal court. He walked to the stand slowly with the cane, and he did not look at Goss's defense table. And he told the truth in a level voice for 38 minutes, and when he was done, he walked back out the same way he had walked in. Warren Goss was convicted on 11 of 14 counts. He was sentenced to 19 years. Dale Morrow pleaded guilty to 3 counts in exchange for cooperation with federal prosecutors investigating his broader network. He was sentenced to 7 years and permanently barred from public office. The sentencing was reported in the news. It was not by that point a major story. Major stories move fast, and then the world moved on. By the time the sentencing happened, most of the world had moved on from the footage and the diner and the 22 seconds of a shaking hand and a coffee cup. But some things didn't move on. Some things stayed. 7 months after the night it all began, on a Thursday afternoon in May, when the Arizona heat had begun to build towards summer, and the desert outside was doing what it did when the temperature climbed, releasing the scent of warm sage and dry earth that was the smell of the season arriving. The front door of Sunset Junction Diner opened, and Devlin Mercer walked in. He was not wearing a hoodie. He was not wearing a bandana. He was wearing a plain blue shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow and jeans and the same work boots he had been wearing 7 months ago, and he was carrying flowers. Yellow ones, the kind bought from a supermarket, because you weren't trying to be fancy, you were just trying to say something true. He stopped just inside the door and looked around the room. Connie saw him first. She was in the middle of the floor, coffee pot in hand, the same position she had been frozen in 7 months ago, except that this time she was not frozen at all. She was just still for a moment, looking at him, and in that stillness was everything the 7 months contained: the fear and the aftermath and the long ordinary work of continuing on. He held up the flowers. She set the coffee pot on the nearest table, which was something she had never done in 16 years of working this floor. And she walked across the diner and took the flowers from him and stood there holding them, looking at him with the complicated, complete expression of a woman who had been through something with another person and was now looking at the evidence that both of them had come through it. "You look better," she said. "I sleep now," he said. "That's it. Sounds small." "It's not small," she said. "Lily started preschool," he said. His voice changed when he said his daughter's name, the way voices always changed when people said the names of the people they had been most afraid of losing. "She loves it. She does finger painting. She comes home covered in it every day. Casey makes me take her shoes off in the garage because the last time—" He stopped. He was embarrassed by the ordinariness of it, the way people were sometimes embarrassed by ordinary happiness when they had been a long time without it, as if the happiness hadn't yet learned it was allowed to be there. "Don't stop," Connie said. He looked at her. "Don't stop talking about it," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite instruction and not quite permission, but somewhere between them, the voice of a woman who had watched a man arrive at the edge of something and wanted him to know that crossing it was allowed. That's the whole point. Devlin looked past her toward the corner booth. Rex Harlow was there. Of course he was. Same seat, same cup, same quality of occupying a space without filling it with noise, the quality of a man who had earned the right to be still in a place he understood completely. He was looking at Devlin with the direct, uncomplicated attention he had given him 7 months ago on the worst night of Devlin's life, and which Devlin had come to understand in the months since, was simply the way Rex Harlow looked at people when he had decided they were worth looking at. Devlin walked to the booth. He stopped at the edge of it. He looked at Rex, at the leather vest and the gray hair and the hands wrapped around the coffee cup. The same hands that had stayed completely still when a gun was pointed at the face they belonged to. The hands that had not moved. "I don't know how to thank you," Devlin said. "Then don't," Rex said. "Sit down." Devlin sat. Connie brought coffee without being asked, set it in front of Devlin, and put the yellow flowers in a glass of water on the counter where they could be seen from the booth. Then she went back to work with the quiet efficiency of a woman who understood that some moments didn't need an audience. Rex looked at Devlin across the table, at the face of a man who had walked through the worst door of his life and come out the other side. Not because the world had been uniformly kind, not because everything had resolved cleanly or easily or without cost, but because on the right night in the right room in a diner on a highway in northern Arizona at 12:17 in the morning, a young man who was out of road and out of options had looked at the only question that was really being asked of him and had chosen the right answer. "Lily does finger painting," Rex said. Devlin looked at him. "How did you, Connie?" "I could hear," Rex said. Devlin half smiled. It was the first time Rex had seen him smile. It was a good smile, the kind that reached the eyes and meant what it looked like, the smile of a man who had enough left in him to mean it. "She does," Devlin said. "Every day. She comes home and she wants to show me every single thing she made. She explains them." He paused. "They're mostly just color, but she explains them like they're something specific. Like this one is a horse, and this one is a mountain, and this one—" He stopped. His jaw worked once. "She brought one home last week and she said it was for me. Just handed it to me. Didn't make a big deal of it." He looked at the table. "It's on the refrigerator." Rex picked up his coffee cup. He held it for a moment. "Don't stop talking about the finger painting," Rex said. "That's the whole point." Devlin looked at him across the booth. His jaw worked one more time. Then he gave the same nod that Rex had first seen at 12:28 in the morning on a Wednesday in October, the single decisive movement that meant yes, and I understand, and I'm going to do the right thing. Outside on Route 89, the highway was doing what it always did. Engines and distance and people moving through the world in the direction of wherever they were going, most of them with no particular knowledge of what this diner was or what it had held on a cold October night. Above the coffee machine, the camera was still there, still recording. The same camera that had captured the shaking hand and the coffee cup in the 22 seconds that 53 million people had watched, and that had meant something different to every single one of them. Justice or compassion or courage or luck or the inexplicable and stubborn persistence of the possibility that things could go differently than the worst version of how they might go. Rex Harlow looked at Devlin Mercer across the booth in the corner of his diner on a Thursday afternoon in May and saw a young father who had walked through the worst door of his life and found on the other side of it a daughter who brought him paintings that were mostly just color, but that she explained like they were specific and important and real, which they were. That was the whole story.